want to be the first, well, not the first, I want to extend to you on behalf of my hometown a warm welcome. I know that you've been here for a bit. I grew up here in Houston, and when I heard that you were coming to have a conference in Houston in early August, I immediately began to pray for you all. And I've been away for many years, moved to Dallas back in the mid-90s for seminary, and been living elsewhere. But it's awesome to be back in my hometown of H-Town. I'd like to begin just by offering a bit of a content advisory warning, however you want to put it. I will be discussing sexual assault and rape tonight, not necessarily in graphic detail, but just it's a heavy subject, and just to give you a heads up that that's where I'm going with it. If you need to get up and get a drink of water or go outside and walk around, or if you just need to, where you're at, just do something different than listen to me, I won't take any offense if you're doing something else other than looking up here. So just to give you a heads up that that's where I'm going. When I was a kid, I dreamed of being the Chinese-American Billy Graham. I had a lot of hair. As a grown-up, I gave my life to my calling of ministry. After working a year for Houston Chinese Church, the church in which I grew up, I went up to Dallas, got my 4-year master's, and then for more than 11 years afterward, I served as an evangelical Christian pastor for Alliance churches, independent Baptist churches, even Southern Baptist churches. And along the way, I gave hundreds of sermons and addressed every significant aspect of human experience. Time and again, I came back to what I believed were the most relevant issues of the day. But in those 16 total years of seminary and ministry, I preached only once about sexual assault and rape. Just once. And even then, it was just an aside. It was just one paragraph out of 5 pages of a sermon focused on something else. It wasn't for lack of material. The Bible, of course, has several accounts of sexual violence and even prescribes punishments. So it's not like God ignores the topic. But for the most part, I did. It is one of my greatest regrets about my time as a clergyman. Speaking about it didn't fit my idea of being a preacher back then. My mental image of a preacher was formed decades earlier. It started in the 5th grade when my parents took me to Rice Stadium here in Houston, an open-air stadium where thousands of people came to hear the Reverend Billy Graham, who spoke to people's longings, deep longings, with a clear voice, a message of a loving God, a warm sense of humor, and a fantastic Southern drawl. I wanted to be just like him. Over the years, I heard Billy Graham speak many times in person and via broadcast, but I never heard him talk about sexual assault or rape. Maybe he did on other occasions, but I didn't catch those messages. In fact, no one else that I knew ever preached about sexual assault or rape. So neither did I. You'll understand why it then surprises a lot of folks that since I left my last pastorate more than 7 years ago, I've worked mostly in advocacy for women's rights and the prevention of relationship and sexual violence. I even have that blog, Feminist Asian Dad. When I launched it, some longtime friends of mine asked whether it was a joke. It's definitely not. But to be completely honest, I'm still kind of surprised myself at the change in my life. It didn't all happen overnight. It really began when my older daughter was born in 2006, with my second daughter arriving a few years later. I was still serving as a minister back then, but that's when I began to consider what my daughters would be up against in this world. By the time I left ministry a few years later, I had started to see things through my daughter's eyes. One day, one of my girls told my wife and me she needed to wear skinny jeans because they're better, she said. Later that year, she asked us for the first time, "Am I fat?" She was 6 years old. I began to connect online with body image activists around the world. I read their blogs, I listened to their conversations as they called out the objectification of girls and women. They then connected me with a broader spectrum of women's rights advocates. I watched their documentaries, attended their conferences, and before long, where I once was blind, I could now see that there are really so many ways that societies around the world push women and girls down. Of course, that's not news to women. But it still feels like breaking news for most of us men, as it was for me. I wish it hadn't taken becoming a dad to daughters for me to start to get it. It shouldn't have. It's a human thing that affects half the human race. But that was the beginning of my new calling as an advocate for women and girls. As a pastor in those years, I really didn't get how horrifically common sexual violence is. I did once I began working for a nonprofit mobilizing men and boys around the world to advocate for women and girls. During the years I was on staff with that organization, I heard many survivors' stories, and I became well acquainted with the truly terrible statistics. In my context of the United States, the most shattering stats to me are that 19% of women in the US will experience rape in their lifetimes, nearly 1 in 5. That's from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And 44% of American women will experience sexual violence sometime in their lifetimes, nearly half. That means that as a pastor, I was undoubtedly preaching to many more survivors than I realized. It wasn't something that just happened to a few of my parishioners. It was widespread. It was epidemic. It needed to be addressed from the pulpit, not just in counseling sessions with individual church members. And I didn't ever address it from the pulpit, except that one time in passing. Preventing such violence and helping survivors to heal, it needed to be talked about from the pulpit. It needed to be woven programmatically into the fabric of the church and its rhythms. I never suggested it. I spent more than 16 years of my life trying my best to be a Chinese-American Billy Graham. I spend the rest of my life trying to be a strong ally for women and girls, and not just my own, my daughters, but for all. And that's now my calling, whether I get to do it vocationally or not. I also feel very much called to call the church to address strongly the problem of sexual violence. It's not a women's issue as I did think of it many years ago. It's a human issue, if anything, because the vast majority of perpetrators of sexual violence are men. Usually I see the stats of 90% and higher, because the vast majority are men who commit these acts, who commit these crimes. It must become a men's issue, and it must also become the church's issue. I'd like to explore 4 reasons why it must be the church's calling. The first is that it's a massive unspoken crisis. It's truly one of the most pervasive and damaging problems in the world. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates that 35% of women have experienced sexual and or physical violence. If the world population is 7.7 billion and just over half are women, well, that's an enormous number of people who've experienced that kind of violation. Again, in my context, the United States, if indeed 19% of American women will be raped in their lifetimes, that's 23 million American women alive today who have been raped or will be. 53 million American women have been or will be violated in some other way due to a sexual assault. And that's just the average. Different groups experience this to a higher degree than others. The Native American community experiences it in even higher dimensions. LGBT folks experience it in very significant ways, more than the average population for certain types of sexual assault. And I don't want to speak of it as only something that affects women, because we know that 1 out of every 6 boys is abused sexually in the United States. The Department of Justice tells us that almost 1 out of every 10 rape and sexual assault victims are men. It affects women and men. So I don't mean to neglect those who have experienced that, who are men and boys, whose pain is as real as any other survivors. This massive unspoken crisis is even bigger than we hear about, because the estimates vary, but at most, 1 out of every 3 sexual assaults, only 1 out of every 3 sexual assaults is actually reported. There are almost always more victims. Well, what does this mean? Among other things, it means that you may not think that you know any sexual assault survivors, but you do. Not a doubt in my mind. The first reason why it must be the church's calling to take up the battle against sexual violence is that it must be the church's calling. It is a massive unspoken crisis. And also because this #MeToo movement is of historic significance. #MeToo represents, in my view, a seismic event in history. It's not a centralized movement. It's just one of those things that just keeps going and going. It's like, for the first time, it seems to me, in the history of the world, is society beginning to recognize and to reckon with that certain types of behavior, where one violates the sexual boundaries of another, is not okay. And people should not be able to get away with it, no matter what their position or power or financial privilege. The Me Too movement is relatively new. It's not just something that only you've heard about just recently. It's something that is pretty recent overall. It goes back maybe about 10, 11 years to an African-American activist, Tarana Burke, who first started using the idea of Me Too and talking with women of color about their experiences of being assaulted. In more recent years, a lot of activity has taken place on college campuses in the United States, using Title IX and holding powerful institutions to account for sweeping things under the rug and protecting powerful people or privileged people. In recent years, people in the news, people whose names are household names, people like Bill Cosby, people like the current President of the United States and other politicians of every political party, These types of people have been accused by many, and we are seeing the reality that has often been hidden or just spoken about in whispers. These things led to the women's marches in January 2017, and in the fall of 2017, actress and activist Ashley Judd spoke out about the abuse that she had suffered at the hands of Harvey Weinstein, media mogul. And shortly after that is when it went viral, as they say. It became #MeToo when actress and activist Alyssa Milano put it out there, and within just a matter of hours, millions and millions of responses had flooded the internet. Millions of women, millions of men talking about, hey, me too. It's happened to me too. And it's happened in other countries too. Some countries, people have had to be creative as to how to talk about it. The report is that in China, because #MeToo has been censored, that people have gotten around that by using the Chinese characters or the Chinese emoji or words for rabbit. Actually, let's get the order right, or else my parents will feel bad for sending me to Chinese school. First, the character for rice, and secondly, the character for rabbit. Because in Chinese, in Mandarin, the character for rice is pronounced mi, and then the character for bunny is tu. So that was one way that they got around it, and we're seeing across the world how people have been inspired by this hashtag. There are many more who have not put out their own experiences online. And that's okay. It's up to each individual person whether they want to say anything and whether they should say anything or not, and then how much to say if they wish to. There's got to be a recognition that behind the hashtag, there are many millions more who have decided that's not how they want to express their experiences. That's a short timeline of the movement. Really, the hashtag is new, but the crisis is not. It's been around since the beginning of human history. But I thank God for this hashtag. We bag on internet activism sometimes, and yeah, it's limited. But for the first time, there is this public expectations that perpetrators will be held accountable, even criminally charged and convicted for harassment, sexual assault, rape, and I believe that God is in it. We mentioned some other public figures earlier. There are even more people who are on our TV screens every day, like Matt Lauer. People like Charlie Rose, Louis C.K., Mario Batali. People who weren't household names, like Dr. Larry Nassar, who for years was the doctor of the USA gymnastics national team and also worked at Michigan State University. At USC, I'm in Southern California, at USC, they've been dealing with trying to reckon with the only full-time gynecologist on staff at the Student Health Center for years had abused hundreds of patients. Me Too is giving courage to people, realizing they are not alone and that it is to be expected that bad behavior will be held to account, and enabling institutions and enabling people like USA Gymnastics or Michigan State and scores of other colleges and universities, they will be held to account for not doing what's right. Another reason why it must be the church's calling to address sexual assault, and not just in the shadows, but very upfront and in very robust ways, because God is working through this #MeToo movement to purify his church. The church is not exempt from sexual abuse and sexual assault. There is the hashtag Church Too that sprung up after Me Too, but there were hashtags even before that. Hashtag silence is not spiritual. Hashtag but he goes to church. The idea behind that was, well, I stayed with my abuser because he's a Christian guy. And some people in my church told me to be a Christian, I had to stay in that marriage. There's hashtag why I stayed. We're all pretty familiar with the stories about the scandals within the Catholic Church of sexual abuse. But Protestants may have an even bigger problem. The decentralization of the Protestant movement makes it even harder to gauge the scope. And so my friend Eugenes, who leads an organization called Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, he says the Protestant problem may be even larger. There have been no shortage of things that have come to light, sad stories, even bringing to account someone as well known as Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Community Church. And my former denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, through some really good reporting by the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News. And courageous women and survivors have stepped up to say to the Southern Baptist Convention, the nation's largest Protestant denomination, this is not okay. That just because we believe in the independence of the local church doesn't mean we get off and have no responsibility. Women like Rachel Denhollander, who was the first of Larry Nassar's victims to publicly call him to account as a former member of the USA Gymnastics national team. My friend Jules Woodson, who here in Houston was a teenager when she was assaulted by one of her pastors, and she told her story to the New York Times just a couple years ago. My dear friend Ashley Easter in North Carolina, who was one of the leading voices behind the For Such a Time as This rally at the last two Southern Baptist Convention national meetings. God is working through Me Too to purify his church. Let's think about it. If other awful things, other, say, crimes in the community, other just bad stuff were happening to folks in our churches with the frequency of sexual assault and abuse, what would we be doing differently? We'd be leaping into action. We'd be saying this is our number one priority as a church. We cannot let a day go by that we do not do something about this. This cannot be the crisis we ignore any longer. But because it's sexual abuse and sexual assault, and because we don't talk about it hardly at all, then it gets overlooked. It's a crisis that's been happening so long that it doesn't feel like one. But it's just as much a crisis as it's ever been. Why must it be the church's calling? Perhaps it's best said that the Bible tells us so. The Bible tells us how God feels about sexual assault survivors. Take just for instance the book of Lamentations, the book that we never really go to on Sunday morning in church services because it's going to be a downer, at least most of it. In Lamentations chapter 5, verse 11, the weeping prophet says, "Women have been violated in Zion, and virgins in the towns of Judah." In Lamentations chapter 3, verse 49, he says, "My eyes will flow unceasingly without relief until the Lord looks down from heaven and sees. What I see brings grief to my soul because of all the women of my city." In Lamentations chapter 3, verse 55, he says, "I called on your name, Lord, from the depths of the pit, and you heard my plea. Do not close your ears to my cry for relief, and you came near when I called you. And you said, 'Do not fear.' You, Lord, took up my case. You redeemed my life. Lord, you have seen the wrong done to me. uphold my cause. And there are no clearer words in Scripture than those of the weeping prophet to say that God's heart is with sexual assault survivors. And if God's heart feels that way, then God's people must take up that call as well. I want to take a moment and just, because I know it's not a subject that is out there, it's a subject that has affected many of us. And I just want to say it again. If you're a survivor of abuse or assault, God's heart breaks for you. This is how much, right? A loving human father would feel shattered if his child experienced sexual abuse. But as a perfect heavenly father, God's pain over what happens to his children is magnified a zillionfold. He is a perfect heavenly father. And if a human father's heart breaks, then so God's heart must break even more. God's heart breaks over the experiences of abuse and assault that happened to you. And God, being a perfect father, engages in no victim blaming. He says, in fact, it is not your fault. You are not to blame. He cares about everything that's happened to you. Psalm 56, verse 8, New Living Translation, puts it this way: You, God, keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book. God is listening. He heard you when you prayed, when it was happening. He hears you now. And his son Jesus, in a very real way, was a victim of sexual violence himself. When he was nailed to a cross, he didn't get the politeness of the Renaissance loincloth draped around his private parts. He was hung up there naked. It was meant to embarrass. It was meant to violate. As Jesus hung naked and bleeding and tortured and beginning to asphyxiate, Jesus was also a victim of sexual violence. Jesus knows what you've gone through, for those of you who are survivors of abuse and assault. That's God's heart for survivors. It must be the heart of the church. Of course, the big question is why? God, if you really heard me, if you really heard my prayers when he was coming down the hall again and I knew what he was coming for, why did you not stop? The first time, the second time, the 500th time I prayed that prayer. I don't know the answer to why. But I know that God is here, now, directly through his Holy Spirit and through his people. And as a church, we want to say to those of you who are survivors, we believe you. It is not your fault. And we are here to support you regardless of what actions you choose to take, whether it is reported or not or whatever. God's heart is with you, and we intend to be God's people and God's agents of supporting you in your continued healing. Those are some of the reasons why I believe strongly that this must be the church's calling as well. Well then, so what can ministry leaders do in helping our churches to move in the right direction, to respond to God's call in the church, to really strongly address these matters in churches? I think, for starters, ministry leaders simply as individuals, even before we talk about the church as a whole, individually we can learn how to help survivors. We can learn what not to say when somebody shares with us that they have been assaulted, whether it happened years ago or whether it happened last weekend. What not to say, things like, well, did you lead him on? Or why were you with that person in the first place? What were you wearing? Why were you drinking? Why did you go to that club? Why didn't you fight or scream? That's what not to say to somebody who's experienced abuse or assault. As individuals, we need to get educated, too, on the variety of victim responses. Neurologically, there are 3 responses to trauma which are true of sexual violence as well. There's fight, there's flight, and there's freeze. There are people who've experienced an attempted sexual assault who do fight back, but there are many who feel frozen, and so they freeze as opposed to fighting back or running. It's a pretty common response, not even one that the person being assaulted has that much control of. Learn what not to say. The converse is learn what to say. I believe you. Give survivors the benefit of the doubt. We can do that because the research consistently backs it up. 92 to 98% of sexual assault accusations are true, in study after study. It's similar to accusations for other major types of crime. A lot of times, people think that, well, he said, she said, so, in a church setting, it'd be like, well, he said, she said, I don't know, they both seem believable. Elder so-and-so has been here. I watched her grow up, and so let's just forgive each other and pray, and we'll call it a day. But the vast majority of accusations are true, so I have come to give survivors the benefit of the doubt until the evidence is overpowering that it's not the case. False accusations do occur, but they are rare. And words that every survivor needs to hear is, I believe you. As individuals, we need to be careful not to expect the stereotype. A lot of times we think of sexual assault that happens when somebody is out walking at night and somebody jumps out from behind the building. Those types of assaults are very common and they happen. But according to the Department of Justice, 78% of rape victims know their attackers before they are assaulted. And that number rises to 90% in college. Yes, weird strangers lurking around, you gotta be careful. I mean, that's what fits our natural, traditional thinking about what sexual assault is like. That happens. But overwhelmingly, it's people that are known to the victim. Not expecting the stereotype also means that we don't just shrug when somebody has experience sex while being passed out from drinking. That's not sex. That's not non-consensual sex. That's rape. I mentioned that there are often responses that people wonder why they didn't fight, why they didn't flee, but they freeze. And they're often, like many other kinds of trauma, there are responses that are kind of in shock type of responses. There was one episode of the TV show Mad Men several years back in which one of the characters was sexually assaulted by her fiance in the office. They closed the door, she didn't want it, he totally did. And so during that moment, if I remember right, she suddenly seems to focus on like the doorknob or a light fixture. And that's a very commonly reported experience where in the midst of trauma, the mind is trying to separate from what's happening. And so very commonly, survivors report responses that are similar to other types of shocked responses. Inconsistent memories are often cited as being things that are obviously going to make something turn out to be false, which is not true. Survivors often have inconsistent memories because that is the nature of trauma. Survivors may even, if the person who attacked them or assaulted them, if they are in a relationship with them, they may go back to the perpetrator. That's not unusual. Going to the police isn't necessarily the best solution. Many times it's not. So as ministry leaders, simply as individuals, we have to be careful not to just expect that things are going to fall into this category of what we think sexual assault is like. We also need to avoid pressuring the victim to go to the police. A lot of times that makes the trauma worse. We have to be really careful in church context not to try to get people to forgive each other and to reconcile. Especially when it comes to minors. If you're a mandated reporter, you have to report it. But if the victim is an adult, every step is their choice, whether they want to go to the police or not. Whether on a college campus they want to go to the Title IX office or not. A lot of times they decide it's not worth it. I think only 2% of rapists ever see time in jail. A lot of times people who come forward and it becomes a publicly circulated thing, they have their own reputation torn to shreds. So what can ministry leaders do? Well, as individuals, we can learn how to help survivors. We can also, as leaders of our churches, take opportunities to address the issue head on. We can preach and teach on sexual assault in the Bible. And tomorrow morning in my workshop on working on college campuses, I'll be talking about the experience of Princess Tamar, the Tamar, daughter of King David. And there are other stories of sexual assault in the Bible that when I was a minister, I didn't touch those. I wish I had. Now I can. To preach on women in the Bible, just the women characters in the Bible. It doesn't have to do with necessarily abuse or assault. Just teaching and preaching on women in the Bible reminds everybody that women are God's people too, and that the heroes of the faith are not simply these guys who were like over, you open sometimes these kids' Bible books and these Joshua is all ripped like he's on steroids, or he got infused with a special serum that the Nazis were working on and it turned him into Captain Canaan. I don't know. Just talking about women in the Bible, doing the things that they do, is part of the corrective for helping boys and girls and women and men in the church to remember that women are not second class, but women are God's people also. We get to advocate as ministry leaders for women's advancement in our churches. But we need to go beyond just talking about it or advocating for it. We need to elevate them to positions of real influence and authority. I would submit to you that we need to let go of the Billy Graham rule so that men who, and still in most church structures, the primary leaders are still guys, that men be willing to mentor women in leadership and not be so freaked out about, what awful, terrible things might happen that are completely unlikely to happen. A real basic thing that ministry leaders can do is to get your kids and youth volunteers background checked. It costs some money, yes, but do it. I left my last pastorate several years ago when we were visiting churches, and even now when we drop kids off at a summer program for VBS or something like that, I won't take my kids anywhere where the kids' volunteers haven't been background checked. It's a basic thing. No, it doesn't catch everybody who's a sexual offender, but it does catch some of them, and it's just a very basic, simple thing to do. As ministry leaders, we can also focus in a different way on how we minister to our men and boys. We've often done there shouldn't even be a hint of impurity among you, don't lust. And all that is important and is part of the scriptures. But to even more fundamentally talk to boys and men about what it means for men and women and boys and girls to be equal. To start when they're young, to start when they're little, in teaching them about equality and gender equality. If we start when they're young, then we catch them before they start to get a bunch of incorrect ideas about gender equality. We catch them if they're young at a time when physically girls and boys are equal out on the playground. In fact, girls are sometimes even more physically able than boys. But to teach, even from a young age, boys and young teen boys and young men, to do what we've been talking about, to teach them about the women of the Bible, to teach equality, to not tell them to be a man, as if they have to toughen up, or, to use more crude language, grow a pair. To teach respect for boundaries even from a young age. And we don't have to start talking about sex with young kids, but we can teach them that when somebody tells them no for whatever, tickling, chasing, when somebody says, no, I don't want to anymore, that we stop. That became something that my wife said that we needed to do when our girls were little. She said, okay, so we really need to help the kids to learn that their boundaries are their boundaries, and they get to say where they begin and end. And so we decided that we were not going to tickle once they said stop. If it bothered them no more, then we would stop. If other people, relatives, whatever, it's just not that we suspected them of anything, ill intent or anything like that, but we wanted the kids to understand from an early age that they had boundaries. And that needs to be the case for boys too. If a bunch of the boys are chasing after girls, and if the girls don't like it anymore, if it's not fun, then the boys need to cut it out. It's a simple way of teaching boundaries, and even teaching consent from an early age. As the boys get older, and I'll be talking about this some more tomorrow morning, we get to teach what it really means to have a Christ-like masculinity, what it really means to be like Jesus in his maleness as he lived here on earth. It's not what folks like Mark Driscoll have said, these warrior Rambo types that want to beat up the bad guy. Jesus overturned tables, yes, but Jesus wept and was always looking for the marginalized. So teaching a Christ-like masculinity. We also get to work with young men and boys in evaluating the news, the video games, pop culture, the types of subtle messages that are still communicated by society at large. We can teach them about consent even without promoting sex before marriage. Just to even say, if you want to kiss her, then you need to be sure that she wants that kiss. We can teach boys and men that it is not only okay, but it is important that they intervene when they see something happening that's not good. When somebody else is being harassed or assaulted, to step into that space, even if it's one of their good friends. I find that boys, even young men overall, we're a lot more insecure than we like to let on, especially around a lot of other guys. When a lot of other guys are doing this or talking about women that way, or if they're putting each other down using girl or woman or a female body part as an insult, we can teach teenage boys, young men, to step into that situation and say, that is not okay. And to make it a part of their upbringing that it's not unusual to intervene and to step into that space, but should be normal, should be natural, should be an expected thing. What can ministry leaders do? Well, as individuals, we can learn how to help survivors. As ministry leaders, we can take opportunities to address the issue. And as ministry leaders, we can really prepare to take action. One way is by training staff and volunteers. What to do if sexual violence or abuse is reported. Again, if you're a mandated reporter, and if an assault, or even, at least in California, if a suspected assault has happened, then if you're a mandated reporter, and ministers are mandated reporters, you have to take that to the government. But it's also important for people in churches, church leaders, to figure out ahead of time, what are you going to do when it happens to your church? Because if it hasn't happened yet, there's a good chance it will. And that's not a good time to be scrambling to figure out what to do or who to get involved. It's great for staff to write out ahead of time, working with their boards, and in our day and age, it's necessary and even helpful, talking with legal counsel, the insurance company that insures the church. Writing out ahead of time, when somebody comes forward, what's going to happen? Who's going to be involved? How are we going to address the needs of the victim and the accused and their families? Oftentimes, their families have both been part of the church for a long time. How are we going to deal with the anticipated divisions in the church between one side and the other? How are we going to deal with the ministries that these folks are involved in, both the accused and the person who's bringing the allegation? What's the church going to do to navigate this? Another part of training that needs to be, another aspect of training, needs to be a recognition that there are almost always more victims than come to light. Again, some just don't want to come forward and say it. And that's their prerogative, unless they're minors. And if they do report it as minors, again, we have to report. But especially in church situations, in my experience, both when I was a minister and in working with sexual assault victims, there are almost always more than what we first hear of. And if we need help in training staff and volunteers, there are others who we can bring in for helping with that training. I mentioned Grace Boz Trevijan's organization, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. That's another really good. And there are others who do this kind of thing who are available for consultation, for even coming in and teaching and working with a group and making presentations. There's other additional resources that we can provide for our staff and volunteers. As a part of figuring out what to do before it happens, it's really helpful to designate a crisis response team, including identifying people who will be called in to do counseling, whether they're inside the church or outside the church. And I'm not talking about just the well-meaning but sort of wants to help everybody kind of person in your church, but the person who is you can trust with confidence, the person who understands discretion, and especially if you have people who are therapists within your church, crisis advocates too, that's enormously helpful. Providing resources is a big part too. The church often has benevolent funds that can be given to folks who are sexual assault survivors in their midst to help them afford therapy, to find healing, whatever that's going to look like for them. Especially if it's something that happened in the church, then it's imperative, I think, for the church to say, this happened on our watch, this happened in our family, and we must not shirk our responsibility to help those who've been wounded to heal. I started off when I was a kid by wanting to be a Chinese-American Billy Graham, and God took me through a very circuitous route to the place I'm at today, being a minister, then being a dad, and then becoming an activist. We've talked over the last several minutes why addressing sexual violence must be the church's calling. And that ministry leaders as individuals, but also in leading their church, that there are quite a few things that we could take from here as just even one or two points that we could say, I want to think more about that. I want to talk about that with other people in my church, and to see how we can make our church respond to God's calling to come alongside survivors. Just by way of some suggested resources, in the United States, there is the group RAIN. That stands for the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network. Oh, I forgot. But they're an awesome organization. They're not a faith-based organization, but they have a lot of resources, even just if you go to their website. I mentioned Boz's group, Grace. They don't have as much of online things that you can just kind of take and print out and distribute, but they have links to resources and books. And they do training. If you contact them, they do have people who are certified in helping to take a church through making it a place that's safe, and that is just, no place is completely without, impervious to threats, but they're good at helping churches to figure that out as to how to do it as much as possible to make your church a place where it can be safe for everyone. My friend Ashley Easter, her blog, she writes a lot, and she also sponsors a conference. She also founded and leads annually the Courage Conference, which has been in North Carolina and which will be in Florida this coming fall. If you go to her website, you can find more info on that. And I'm really excited. My friend Mary DeMuth, who's from Dallas, who I met at the Courage Conference a couple of years ago, her book, We Too, is coming out very soon. She's from a Southern Baptist congregation. She is herself a survivor, and I'm really looking forward to her book coming out. just by way of some resources that might be helpful. And just to give you an idea, the subtitle of her book, I can't read, like even if it was here. I'm at that age where I have to take off my glasses to look at things. But the subtitle reads, "We too, how the church can respond objectively to the sexual abuse crisis." Now, that's why, and given knowing Mary, that she's just really solid, I'm just really excited for that book to be published. I think it's on Harvest House. John Ortberg, who pastors in the Bay Area and who's written a ton of books with really long names, who used to pastor at Willow Creek, and who, if you followed some of the story online, was involved in helping to hold his friend and former lead pastor, Bill Hybels, to account. John Ortberg writes, anyone who may have been victimized by people in power needs to know that the Church of Jesus is their refuge and champion. And my friend Jules Woodson, survivor of sexual assault herself, she says, we as a church of all places should be getting this right. It's unfathomable to me that the secular world is taking a stand. The church should have been the first group to stand up and say, we will not allow this. And we are not the first group, we as the church. But now that we have joined the battle, we will not stop. God calls us to persist. God calls us to come alongside those who've experienced abuse and assault. God calls us to stand in protection of those who have not experienced that, and to make our churches ones that reflect the character of Jesus Christ, not just in a public-facing way, but even in those things that are known only to few in our churches. There cannot be any more things swept under the rug in preservation of a pastor's reputation, to protect the seminary, to protect the denomination. God is purifying his church, and we will join the battle, and we will carry on his call. We can do no less. Let me pray for us. Abba, thank you so much for showing us very clearly in the Holy Scriptures your heart for survivors. And we pray that we as individual believers and that we in our churches would be supportive of those who've gone through such difficult experiences. Help us to be your agents of support and healing. Help us to make our churches places that do not ignore the crisis that is unspoken and even forgotten. Help us to answer your call, to care for those under our watch, that we might be indeed a refuge and champion and a witness to the world of who you are. And we pray these things through the blood of Jesus. Amen.